And even the amount of agency that I saw in the projects and these kids working independently, you could tell that they owned their learning.
Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello everyone, welcome to Hallway Conversations. My name is Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
For those of you new here, we are trying to create space where people can play around with a few ideas in the context of what it means to teach and lead Christianly. And one of our deep hopes is that you might be encouraged to go back to your classroom, your staff room, or your hallway and engage in some of your own conversations. We also love it when listeners give us feedback, suggest ideas for shows, or even send in questions. So if you feel compelled to do so, please send that to hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. Finally, we are going to start a short series next week based on the book Flourishing Together by Andy Wolf and Lynn Swanner. You definitely don't need to read the book in order to join in on the fun, but if you want to read along with us, Dave will leave a link in the show notes so that you can purchase it. We're going to engage with part one starting next week. Abby and Dave, although I don't watch late night talk shows as much as I used to, there was a time when I was a big Jimmy Fallon fan. Although lately I find I have more of an affinity for Stephen Colbert, who's quite brilliant, by the way. Yeah. On a side note, I recommend anyone listening to this conversation to look up Colbert's dialogue with Andrew Garfield about grieving, or his response when Dua Lipa asked him about his faith. It's quite profound. Mm-hmm. This did make me think, though, about today's check-in question, so here it is.
Okay.
You are all both quite famous, and you'll be even more famous one day. In my world, you're quite famous.
Oh.
You're very kind, Matthew.
So my question is, when, not if, you get your own talk show, who will be your first guest on opening night?
Oh, man. Okay, so I've mentioned before on the show that I really enjoy the Holy Post podcast with Sky Jitani and Phil Vischer. I would love to interview Phil Vischer and just hear his story of where VeggieTales came from. After VeggieTales, the Big Idea Company kind of imploded. Like, how did that actually go? I'd love to hear that piece of his story. And I just think he would be a fascinating person who kind of has a finger on the pulse of the weird evangelical subculture in the American church, and to just hear his wonderings about that. I would be really fascinated.
Yeah, I just want to thank him for all the songs that I cannot unstick from my brain. You started talking, and I right away was like, oh, where is my hairbrush?
Right?
Thanks, Phil, if you ever listen to this.
Yeah.
Abigail, how about you?
Okay. So it has to be an author, probably, right?
Does it?
Said the English teacher.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just thinking about books that I've read in the last 10 years that I was like, I really would love to talk to that person. I'm going to go with Tara Westover. Have you guys read Educated?
I have not, but I'm familiar. Yeah.
I think I would interview her. So she grew up in an extreme version of Mormonism in Idaho. Her parents were survivalists, and she never went to school until she went to Brigham Young. She got in. Wow. And then she ended up getting a PhD from Cambridge and wrote a book about her experience. It's a memoir called Educated. Yeah. You may have heard of it.
Yeah.
And just a fascinating story. Like, I had to put it down at times because it was so intense.
Sure.
Like, I couldn't keep reading it for a while. Like, I wanted to, and I just like had to. There's a piece in the middle. I don't do well with like physical injury descriptions in books, and I had to like put it down for a while and couldn't read it because of like it was intense.
Wow. Cool.
And so I think her story is fascinating. She lives in New York now, and she's, I think, cut ties mostly with her family, and so it's just a fascinating story about her like quest for education and how she got there. Yeah. So that would be what I choose.
Yeah, that's good. That's intense.
All right, questionnaire. You asked.
Yeah.
I would 100% have to go with Bruce Springsteen or Bono if I could pick two. If I could get you both at the same time, that'd be great. I find both of them fascinating public figures. I find their songwriting, their focus on justice. I'd love to talk to Bruce Springsteen, just about his he's so justice oriented and just kind of this blue collar singer, and yet there's a depth of spirituality there, and I just was like, where's that coming from, and what's that about? He has some songs that have just moved me tremendously, but I would say the same is true of Bono and U2, and just to like, hey, where's to share their story, just what's kind of motivating the work that they do, the lyrics inspiring them. So if I could have either of those, I'd settle for either one.
Just settle for one of those.
Okay. Thanks for sharing, guys. So I know that today, Dave, I believe we have a question from a listener.
We do. Yeah. So we have a question today from Loretta, our friend from Prince Edward Island. Hello, Loretta. And here's the question that she raised for us. Our school, in the last few years, has embraced project-based learning as one of our preferred teaching methods. I'd love to hear a conversation about this. What are your thoughts on PBL? And do you think there are some good things about PBL and maybe some downfalls of teaching in a PBL style? Yeah. So thanks for that question, Loretta. It's a really good one.
Yes.
All of those things.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Well, what do you think, friends? Project-based learning?
Yeah,
pros, cons?
So it was interesting to me that she, I think she used the phrase preferred teaching method. So I would love to ask Loretta sort of what that means in terms of like, is there an expectation that you're doing PBL? Like, that doesn't sound like, and this isn't meant as a shot or anything. It doesn't sound like a PBL school, but rather they're playing around with PBL, but it's not part of like the pedagogy of the entire school that guides their philosophy. So I just wonder, that would be a clarifying question for me.
Can you say more about like what the difference between being a PBL?
Yeah, like so if I think about a PBL school, so Abby and I might be able to talk about this a little bit more later. Abby and I actually visited a PBL school last week, so this question's actually
very topical.
A wonderful time because I've been reflecting a lot on that, and I actually have as many questions about it as I do. Like, it was helpful to be there, but like anything, when you know something, it raises more questions, right?
Sure.
So I have more. But if I think about that as a PBL school, and Abby, correct me if I'm wrong or chime in on this, is really every class, like this, and even the schedule, but all decisions around teaching and learning are filtered through a PBL. Or filtered through PBL. So how do we do project-based learning in every part of our school? So it's not a preferred pedagogy; it is the pedagogy, right?
So
it's
the
really
whole school is
totally
around project-based learning.
Totally,
every part of it.
Yeah. And so it was even interesting there, and I could be wrong about this, but like they even showed us their schedule. They basically have blocks of humanities PBL in the for 2 to 3 hours and then they actually partnered some really interesting subjects. Or what was it? Physics?
Like art and science, for example. Blocks.
We're paired together as PBL, and these teachers had to work together.
So you have like an art teacher and a science teacher that are going to co-teach a project-based block.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It was, and they created some really cool things.
I bet.
Yeah. Amazing things. So that's how. So to come back to your initial question, Dave. So that's how I would when I think of a PBL school.
Sure.
I would say it's PBL all the time.
And that's very different from one teacher inside a classroom doing a project, right?
Right. Because that was my thought initially, too. So I think back to the years I taught science at the middle school. We did a ton of projects. Like, my whole MO as a science teacher was, okay, we're going to learn about Newton's laws for motion, so we're going to make these cool little maglev cars out of magnets, and they're going to race down the track, and we did these great projects. And the kids learned a ton. I'm not saying. But I would not say I was doing project-based learning. It was more teaching through projects. And I think that's maybe a subtlety in this, but I'm wondering if that's helpful to kind of distinguish the two, to say like project-based learning seems like an overarching pedagogy versus using projects for learning. Is that fussy or
no? One of the things as you're talking, Dave, one of the things that, and again, I could be wrong because I'm still continuing to grow in my understanding of project-based learning, but one of the hallmarks for me, in my mind at least, is sort of who the audience is.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about projects, at least as how I've done projects as a teacher, I think about the primary audience as basically the teacher, right? Or maybe the parents.
But the students are doing work for the teacher's eyes only.
Yeah,
most of the time.
Yeah, totally. They're producing something
Mm-hmm.
in order to receive something, which is a grade.
Sure.
And and we've joked about this before, right? So many projects are dumpster projects, right? You spend all this time, you get your grade, you throw it on the dumpster on the way to the car on your way home, never to be seen again. Whereas if I think about one of the hallmarks of project-based learning for me is sort of like the audience, right? Is it's much deeper than that. It's to be, ultimately it's to be of service to the world, right? To contribute to the common good. So how is what we're learning here not only going to benefit me as an individual, but how is it also going to be to benefit the community in which the school is located? So when we visited last week, that was one of the interesting notice and wonders for me. Like I noticed that there was a lot of projects hanging up on the walls in the school.
Oh, yeah.
So my first reaction to that was, like I sort of think about audience to be a service to the world outside of the school. But then I thought some of those projects, were beautiful, they were vulnerable, there was some amazing poetry, and I was like, no, like you can still be of service to the world within your school, right? Yeah. Because those projects were being of service to me. Like they were impacting me in a deep way.
And they talked about exhibitions. Yeah. Did you hear some of that too? Right? Yeah. So they would have exhibitions of their learning too. So like there was an art installation, right? And so there was an explanation under it, and then like it was clear that they had hosted an art show, and there was like a visitor's guide to the art show, and visitors were encouraged to ask the different artists who were exhibiting questions about their work, right? And so it was literally a public art showing of their work that they had combined with it. I think it was a humanities. I think there was a social element to it as well. Okay. And also I saw one which fascinated me. The 7th graders were building a flight simulator.
Yeah, this was amazing.
Oh my
Grade 7 students building a flight
simulator.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
It was amazing. Like, and it was like a computer programming element, like teacher. And they also were doing another component with that where I think they were designing something for a group of people that flew veterans, maybe. Like that was the project, the service project part of it. I can't remember exactly the details, but they were partnering with this group along with their flight simulator who flies around, I think, veterans I don't think it was honor flight. I think it was something else, but it was
something
similar mission. Sure, and so that was the service to the world piece.
Neat.
That they were pairing with this, like building this flight simulator that probably won't get used, right, outside of their own learning, but there was like a pairing of it with an outside something.
The difference, though, for me with that is, you mentioned hierarchy of audience, right? So who benefits from me doing that? Of course, the student doing the learning benefits. Yes, they do. But if the student and teacher are the only people who actually get to see the work, what a shame.
Yeah. Right. And so that's where the exhibitions come out.
Right.
Yeah. Which is a cool, and they had all kinds of experts in helping them.
Sure.
From like the flight industry, and it was neat.
That's cool.
Yeah. My one question, like when I think about Loretta's question, is hey, how are they defining project-based learning there?
Yeah.
And I also just think, hey, what does professional development look like? I think if a school, even if it's the preferred pedagogy of choice, my encouragement then is if we really want to lean into this as a school, then there needs to be ongoing professional development. There needs to be ongoing resources and collaboration. Like one of the when we happened to visit the school, they had a small interview panel with a number of teachers, and they highlighted that, like this idea of collaboration, of working together. And when you visited the school, like to me, it seemed like this would take a tremendous amount of energy for students, but for teachers as well. Like there's a lot of variables there. Even just the physical and emotional energy of pouring into these students, of thinking about the needs, to design the needs of the community, to design a good, authentic project and a learning experience. The thought of doing that by myself seems insurmountable, even just as I talk about it now. So it was interesting that, to hear, hey, they put physics and art together, which is, like I said, I would never think to do that. But also I think, hey, like, you just need to lean on each other, lean on each other as teachers.
One of my biggest learning moments at that school was when the principal was actually talking about the structures that enabled it to work, right? And he said something about the schedule that has totally stuck with me. He said, the more complicated your schedule, the harder it is for teachers to do complex work with students. And the simpler your scheduling is, the more complex work can get done.
So they just have
huge blocks.
Big blocks of time.
Yeah, they do like an advisory and maybe like math, and then they have a huge humanities block, lunch, huge science plus something else block, and maybe one elective at the end of the day.
Oh, yeah. That's a fundamental shift in thinking, not just about like what the content of the curriculum is, but like the structures that support teachers.
Yeah, and instead of, what I thought too was fascinating was, instead of like, okay, you're going to take English freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, right? Like they would do humanities and social studies one year. Next year you're doing theater.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You know what I mean? For a whole, and then so it's, and every student progresses through that same schedule, but then you still have this huge block. It's not all these tiny little classes that you're trying, and then they can do field trips much easier, and then they can
do it.
You can develop these things. Your schedule is just simpler, so it's easier to collaborate, and it's easier to work.
So what I'm wondering though is like pragmatically, how does it feel being in this school? Like, I have to confess, I'm really jealous hearing you guys talk about this. Like the feel in the building. I mean, this strikes me as, forgive me, it strikes me as messy learning. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah.
Like, I think of myself in my own teaching practice, I like to have a pretty tightly organized course, not necessarily the classroom, but the course. Yeah. And I feel like you'd have to be able to just flex with things. And
I'd say that's true.
Yeah.
It did strike me like there was an energy there, like that was palpable to me. And you could, like, one of the things that I loved about it, if I'm thinking about Loretta's question, like pros and cons, one of the things that I really, really appreciated about it was how infrequently I heard teacher voices and just the energy, and just even how loud they were in a beautiful way of student voices, just hearing them collaborate. You could feel, in my mind, and again, Abby, you can speak to this, but you could feel students were empowered there. Their voice mattered, literally. So I just think about all the skills that you are developing in students around building relationship, around collaboration. I imagine when you're working on projects with other people, there's going to be disagreement, even serious conflict. Sure. And so I think, hey, how are we helping students resolve that? So I think that to me was one of the things that jump out. And then I just think about, how much deeper does student learning go when students have a chance to discuss ideas, instead of just, here's what Beamers is saying and I'm receiving it and I'm putting it in a, whereas it's like, hey, no, we're going to talk to each other about these. So I just think the exchange of ideas even has the potential to lead to deeper learning.
I think the most impactful part for me, too, kind of going from what you were saying, is the amount of student agency that was there was off the charts high. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So I'm thinking about schools that I've seen, that I've been at, that I taught at, and you're absolutely right. It's neat, but it's very teacher-centric.
Right. Yeah.
Right? It's very, I'm going to decide the agenda, here's what we're going to do. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist there, but when we got there, students were showing us around the campus.
Oh, yeah.
How many principals could give that up?
Without it, and they were well trained, and also very invested and very comfortable leading groups of adults around their campus.
And 11 years old.
That they had not met, right? One of them was a 6th grader.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
And she was having very easy conversations with a group of strange adults at her school, showing them around, right? And even the amount of agency that I saw in the projects and these kids working independently, you could tell that they owned their learning.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't that someone was telling them what to do. It was that they were part of that.
Yeah. What was that one line, Abby?
One of the teachers was sharing about how one of the great parts of building a project, and by project they mean like multiple month, study and investment into this, is that they didn't know as teachers who was going to shine in that project. Mm-hmm. They couldn't predict it. Mm-hmm. And neither could the students, because the projects were so different from each other and really did involve diverse skill sets. Yeah. Right? And so they couldn't predict who was going to be the star of the project. And that to me says too, we might tell ourselves that our learning is diverse and meant for diverse students, but I can still pick, even in my own class now, you know what I mean? My assignments are still geared very traditionally academic, right? I have a pretty good idea after the first few weeks of class about who will succeed academically. Versus a project where you don't know who's going to emerge as a leader.
So this has me thinking too about the definition of what a project really is going to look like, right? If we can kind of distill some practices for teachers who are listening to this, like what's going to be a shift that they can make. So giving students an authentic voice and real agency, not just the illusion of voice or the illusion.
Right? Can you really give it over to them?
Right. And so as a teacher, you have to be willing that it's going to get messy. I mean, physically messy, but intellectually messy too, because you have to let go of some of it, right? The other thing, I'm thinking about the difference between projects and an authentic problem that really matters. So something students are going to care about too, right? And so, maybe we have to have a clear problem or project in mind because we've got curriculum goals that we have to ensure that we're going to meet. There's parameters for that. But does that sound right too? Like that it's going to have to be some kind of a driving problem that gets addressed.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. So one of the English teachers I talked to showed me a book that I think they were grade 11 maybe or 12. Students wrote, so they were, as obviously an English class, so they read and wrote widely, but they created a manual for their teachers about them as learners.
Whoa.
And read deeply in educational psychology, actually, and trauma-informed learning, and also just like personal narratives.
Yeah.
About like, this is how you teach high schoolers. Yeah. And wrote a manual.
That's fascinating.
For their teachers.
I love that.
Isn't that cool? And like put it together in an anthology.
Yeah.
And edited the whole thing, and like that was their authentic project.
And what a transformational learning experience that is for those kids, right? The amount of personal investment in it, the agency that they have in that, but the real learning.
Yeah, and what else is happening there, even informationally, right? Is there? Hey, I right away when I saw that I was like, what if this is the first time anyone's ever asked them this question? Yeah. What's the potential for healing? And I'm not saying, but what's I always think about that. What's the potential of any of these projects? And that's what I really appreciated that. My one wonder about it was, and this isn't a criticism. It's more, I think I have to learn. So Loretta, this is coming back to your question. Is my wonder about it is, what does assessment look like? Like this idea of like, how do you know that they know, or how do you know that they've learned? And the answer has to be more than, well, the project's finished. Well, there it is, right? What does learning along the way look like? What does that formative evaluation look like? And I just didn't understand that, and I did wonder. And I think the English this project helps me understand it better, but just, hey, like at some level, there's got to be some standards that you're going to be held to. So I'm not saying that in project-based learning in Prince Edward Island or at High Tech High that's not happening. I would just wonder as a teacher, how do I, like, again, this is where the Pro-D for me comes in. Is how are we, two things can be true. We can be doing project-based learning and meeting standards, but how do you do that? That seems really complex in my limited understanding.
Well, thank you guys for sharing your stories. And Loretta, thanks for your question, because I think this was very timely and it all kind of came together here.
Friends, we know that your time is valuable, and we want to thank you for joining us today for another hallway conversation. So whether it is this day, this week, this month, we hope that the Lord gives you what you stand in need of. And as you go into this day, let us send you with this blessing. So to our listeners, who we are so thankful for, God go before you to lead you. God go behind you to protect you. God go beneath you to support you. God go beside you to befriend you. Do not be afraid. May the blessing of God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be upon you. Do not be afraid. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a good day.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.
I don't do well with hypothetical scenarios.
This is why I try to come up with hypothetical scenarios
Put her on the spot.
as much as possible.